Hi, fellow paper crafters. My name's Melissa Kerman of Melissa's Crafting Treehouse. You can find me at www.melissascraftingtreehouse.com and also on Facebook and Pinterest. So I am a self-professed technique junkie. I love techniques and I love building layers to create interesting effects and textures in my paper crafting projects. So today I have a really fun project for you made with the To a Wild Rose stamp set. This is something that I showed at the On-Stage local event in Charlotte, North Carolina this past April of 2019. And I talked a little bit about building blocks in my techniques and cards. So we're using several techniques here, or building blocks, to build up the layers and interest in my project. So I'm starting with an antiqued background. I like to call it an antiqued background. I'm using a large F-size acrylic block, and I just applied my crumb cake ink directly to that block. And I always start with the lightest color first so I don't contaminate my lighter colors with the dark inks. And then I went in and put some of the soft suede ink onto the acrylic block. And then I sprayed it with some water. So now you see I'm basically stamping with that watery brownish sort of background onto my watercolor paper to give me sort of an antique base. Now next I'm going to dry my piece of cardstock. Now you could wait, but I'm going to use a heat tool on the low setting to just dry it. And it has to be completely dry. This is very important. So now I'm done with my building block, or layer number one. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to do some heat embossing. I've got one of my images from the To a Wild Rose stamp set and my embossing buddy. Now if your paper is wet still, it's going to kind of ruin your next step. So that's why it's super important that it's really dry, like bone dry. But you're also going to use the embossing buddy because it will help the paper be less staticky and make sure that the embossing powder doesn't stick where it doesn't belong. So I'm using my Versamark, which is a clear sticky ink, to stamp my rose image. And then I'm going to go ahead and heat emboss it with copper embossing powder. So now I'm bringing in my copper embossing powder, and I'm just going to put that whole piece of cardstock into the powder and cover the whole thing, tap it off, and then I'm going to go ahead and heat it. And after I'm done heating it, this will be the completion of building block, or step number two. So now that this is heat embossed, we can move on to layer number three, or step number three. We're going to add some color to that rose. And I'm going to be using a homemade ink pad. So I made myself a homemade ink pad, starting with a single layer of felt and two different colors of reinkers. I'm using Balmy Blue and Blueberry Bushel. I'm starting with the Balmy Blue. Now you can use and reuse an ink pad like this that you've made and store the piece of felt in a plastic container of some sort. I like to store mine in a stamp case. And if you use it a second time or third, or the next times you use it, you just need to refresh the colors or spritz it with a little bit of water. So I've started by adding a little bit of my Balmy Blue on the outside, and now I'm adding some Blueberry Bushel to the center. I generally like to use more of the lighter colors than the darker colors because the darker colors tend to dominate and bleed and blend and take over the lighter colors. So now when you're doing two-step stamping, which this is, it has multiple stamps that layer one on top of the other. You have to be careful to make sure you know how the stamp itself is oriented, and that it's oriented in the same way when you stamp on top of the first image. So you can see I'm making sure that my images are sort of in the same general position on the stamp, and I'm eyeballing that right there. And then I'm inking up my stamp. And then I'm going to go ahead and go right over the top of my image. Now this is a really easy way to get multiple colors in an image using a homemade ink pad, because you can apply the colors however you wish and get some really interesting effects. So now I chose for my next step or layer to add some color with Balmy Blue sponge. So I'm going to go ahead and sort of fill in the gaps of that flower to give it sort of a very soft, light blue look in the spots where it shows through to the antiqued background. Now there is another image that you could overlay, yes, a third image that you could overlay over these first two. I chose to get a softer look by using the sponge. Now I'm taking that sponge again and I'm going around the edges of my focal piece, and in my mind I'm thinking it's sort of the sky, so I'm trying to get some blue to the background a little bit. Now I'm bringing in my blueberry bushel ink, and I'm going to do a couple things with this. I'm going to stamp that center image right there in the center, and then I'm using my sponge to darken it a little bit. I wanted a deeper blue in the center, and then I always like when my pieces are sort of well framed, so I've added a little bit of that dark blueberry bushel to the very edges. And yet you still see the lighter blue as well coming in further from the edge. So I don't know how many layers I'm on now, but I've done lots of layers on this piece, and I'm coming in with yet another one. I'm going to stamp some of the leaves off to the side of the rose using my Mossy Meadow ink. After stamping the first round of leaves, I felt like I still wanted a little bit more dimension to my piece, so I went in with a couple of stamped off leaves here and abouts, just to sort of fill it in, add a little more green, and that's what I'm doing here. I actually used multiple generations of inking there, first, second, and third inking, and it's a wonderful way to get the feeling of depth in your piece because the lighter images look sort of like they're in the background. Now I'm coming in with my early espresso ink. I'm going to use an image from the Timeless Texture stamp set to add some sort of specks here and abouts in the background around the flower. And I think this might be, oh, I don't know, step or building block number 7 maybe. So there were lots of steps to create this focal piece, but I really love it, and it's ended up being one of my favorite pieces that I made with the To a Wild Rose stamp set. We also made this project as a team in my team meeting. I thought they would all enjoy it, which they did. So pretty much all that's left is to assemble this card, and I'll start with stamping the Crackle Paint background stamp on my Mossy Meadow cardstock. Now I've done that off camera, and I did choose to use a stamped off layer of that ink instead of full ink. You'll see when I'm taking off this back layer that is the full inked side, and the side that's facing up is stamped off. It's so subtle you can barely even see it, but I felt like the full ink was just a little bit too strong. So before I attach my Mossy Meadow piece to the card base, I need to attach my burlap first. So I'm putting some glue dots in several spots along the burlap, and I'm just placing it across the front. So I'm attaching it there on the front and then wrapping it around both ends, and there are glue dots on either end to hold it in behind. And then I've got adhesive on the back side already, but just for some added strength, I put some glue dots on the burlap itself on either end, so that would hold it down onto the Early Espresso card base. And now all I have left to do is attach my Early Espresso focal backing, which I'm doing right there, and my focal piece. And my card is all done. So are you a technique junkie too? If so, you might be interested in my new technique class series. To learn more, go to the Tutorials and Classes tab on my website. I hope you've enjoyed my project today and will come back and visit me sometime soon. Plus, make sure to check out the video description below for lots of useful links, and if you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, share it with friends, and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thanks for spending some time with me today, and happy crafting!